That was actually a very generous introduction. I think maybe next time I'll send a shorter bio. So thank you very much for taking the time to come and hear me speak, and I hope it kind of rewards the time you've kind of allocated. In this presentation, in keeping with the orientation of the project in focusing on questions of transitional justice, in this presentation I'm interested in a parallel or a series of tracks, one of which relates to questions of transitional justice and the other of which relates to forms of activism in the field that's come to be known as kind of human trafficking and modern day slavery. So a lot of my work to date has kind of focused on the politics and history of slavery and the ways in which slavery has been invoked or applied in various contemporary contexts. And as part of this work, one of the questions that constantly comes up is, well, how does slavery today relate to conversations about the history and legacies of historical slave systems? So there's two ways in which slavery is talked about in a contemporary context. One of which is this activism around modern day slavery, most often articulated in relation to the question of human trafficking. And then parallel to that, there's a conversation about repairing historical wrongs, the legacies of the past and how they might be addressed, most recently articulated in relation to things like Black Lives Matter, the prison industrial complex, and broader claims about redress for the cumulative wrongs that have been defined on the basis of kind of relations between Europeans and Africans most particular, but also more broadly about connections between the global north and the global south. So this presentation represents a kind of attempt to get under the skin of the politics and motivations behind these two parallel political projects. So in this presentation, I'm going to juxtapose a slightly stylized and kind of overly kind of essentialized account of some of the key motivations behind what I describe on the one hand as the politics of repair and on the other as the politics of rescue. So you can kind of see in the visual kind of representation on your left you have a kind of emblem of rescue, and on the right you kind of have what I regard as an emblem of repair. And what's interesting for my purposes is that while they've been around in their modern incarnation for roughly 3 decades now, it's relatively rare that activism against contemporary slavery and human trafficking intersects with claims for reparations for the wrongs of the past. But there are occasions where the two conversations intersect, and to kind of give you a sense of what I'm talking about, I just want to briefly talk about this incident in Jamaica a couple of years back where David Cameron, before he'd kind of disastrously lost the Brexit election, was coming to Jamaica at a point where the CARICOM nations had very strongly sought to assert the need for reparations for transatlantic slavery and its legacies. And David Cameron went to Jamaica, and he was under intense pressure arising out of the politicization of reparations, and he did several things. The first of which was donate a prison as a form of kind of development aid. But he also very specifically denied the claim for reparations. So he says, I don't think reparations are the answer. I think that now what we should be doing is looking to the future. Relatively standard response. But also, and significant for my purposes, not least the vital work that we do today getting rid of modern slavery and people being trafficked across our planet. And this happens time and time again. Governments and officials in Europe and North America, when faced for claims for restitution for the wrongs in the past, seek to shift the conversation to instead talk about the urgency to address contemporary issues arising out of slavery today. So I want to kind of explore some of the implications for this point of convergence and reflect some briefly on why one is comfortable and the other is confrontational. So in this context, assuming I can hit this, I want to briefly introduce you to two modes of political engagement. They're slightly simplified, but I want to suggest that much but not all of the political motivations associated with human trafficking and modern slavery can be defined in terms of what I describe as the politics of rescue. And the politics of rescue involves forms of benevolent paternalistic protection that arise out of dyads between saviors and supplicants. And this dyad between saviors and supplicants has forms of self-validation wherein the superior moral status of the person doing the saving has a reinforcing and validating effect of conferring and legitimating the privileged position within which they occupy. And it's emblematic. I picked this picture in particular because the help me phrase involves a disembodied person whose face is not yet evident, who is chained, and as a consequence involves a particular understanding of a problem that can only be resolved by dint of external intervention. So that's the first kind of idea, the politics of rescue. And I'm juxtaposing this with the politics of repair. And the politics of repair has kind of its genesis and intellectual origin in part in transitional justice schemes. But it's important to note here that transitional justice schemes can't be taken as a kind of panacea for problems, because in a lot of cases, transitional justice is more interested in closure and sealing off the past rather than kind of properly excavating and interrogating it. So in this incarnation, it's inspired by themes that exist within transitional justice, but it doesn't necessarily be taken as equivalent to transitional justice as practice, because transitional justice as practice is deeply flawed. So the element here is not about help provided, but redress for harms inflicted. And it necessarily involves forms of self-criticism and self-reflection, sometimes based around theological models associated with atonement and redress, and also involves ideas of apology and restitution for cumulative wrongs. So it's slightly simplified, but I nonetheless think it's useful to understand some of the politics associated with these two movements in terms of different analytical schemes, diagnostic frameworks, and also by definition, different types of motivations and engagements. So in my kind of genealogy of this, I date both of them to the 1990s. That's not to say, of course, that there aren't longer histories, but I do think there's something kind of significant about the last 3 decades that you can involve a rough periodization here. So on the one hand, you kind of have a genesis and inspiration within kind of human rights, particularly as articulated around questions of the legalization and defense of rights. And then in parallel, but not necessarily in interconnection, you have kind of ideas associated with the age of apology, transitional justice, and truth and reconciliation. So, you know, this is the kind of John Porpy idea of making whole that which was smashed. And I kind of follow him and others, Rhoda Howard Hassman and many others, in kind of very much thinking that from the 60s and 70s, a kind of progressive forward-looking has been reconfigured in the 1990s onwards to kind of excavate and deal with kind of submerged and subterranean wrongs and ills and problems and the like. So they have different origins and points of inspiration, and they rarely intersect. But the fact they intersect doesn't mean that they aren't interrelated. So here, drawing off a different literature, I look at work that arises out of kind of forms of critical humanitarianism. And here, I'm particularly interested in the work of Clifford Bobb, amongst others, who seeks to understand social movements, activism, argumentation, as taking place within a competitive marketplace. And the idea here is there's no meritocracy of suffering, where there's a natural assumption that things that emerge on the agenda do so organically out of an assessment of need, but instead arise out of tacit forms of competition amongst causes and constituency. There's limited resources, there's limited allies, there's limited TV time, there's only so many speaker spots at the United Nations, and so on and so forth. So within this kind of marketplace of ideas and activism, the idea here is that some causes emerge as successful within this competitive process, while others struggle to gain traction and audiences and investment. And there's a lot I could say about this. The book I kind of launched last night is kind of dealing with that in more detail. But for my purposes in this presentation, I'm most interested in thinking about how and to what extent the recent campaigns against modern slavery and human trafficking have been successful to the degree they have. And I just want to briefly give you an example where here we have Theresa May, often kind of jokingly referred to as Saint Theresa May, who has very much placed herself firstly as Home Secretary and then more recently as Prime Minister as being a modern exemplar or exponent of the British's longer history in engaging with the abolition of slavery, which they so successfully created in the first place. So in this context, governments and key figures throughout the globe have engaged with questions of anti-slavery, modern slavery, contemporary slavery, human trafficking, to a degree that is highly unusual within human rights activism circle. So by way of kind of illustration of this, I've included here the list of ratifications of various UN treaties. And you'll note that the one with the circles, the orange circles, is the Palermo Protocol. And that's the kind of foundational kind of international instrument which is engaging with questions of trafficking. And you'll see that it's very quickly received a level of support and endorsement and rhetorical commitment which sets it apart from other causes and constituencies within the broader kind of pantheon of human rights campaigning more generally. So I have a lot of explanations for the sources of this success, and I can't go into all of them in detail, but what I would say here is that within this competitive marketplace that I've kind of identified, we're talking about a cause that stands out for its degree of success. And in this context, I'm interested in further exploring the underlying motivations and diagnostic frameworks which are associated with this cause and contrasting them with my other counterpart. So, what do I mean by the politics of rescue? The politics of rescue, as it kind of relates to contemporary anti-trafficking, has a number of features. The first of which is a connection or harnessing of the kind of infamy and iconography of transatlantic slavery, which effectively assigns an elevated and exceptional status to the problem of slavery today, human trafficking today. And this, in effect, seeks to stand apart contemporary slavery from other issues. But this is a rhetorical strategy that many have tried, but on this occasion has been more successful than others. And in my framing, at least, in a kind of simplified version of a kind of larger argument, part of what arises out of the popular appeal of this particular cause and the constituency surrounding it is the idea of intervention as involving forms of rescue, where external intervention from someone in a superior and enlightened position is required in order to assist and release people who are in positions that are effectively denuded of autonomy, There's elements of kind of more complicated sexual voyeurism and some of the stuff associated with human trafficking. But in a broader kind of narrative, I'd suggest that paternalistic protection, the idea of a dyad between supplicants and saviors, is not exclusively, but is often primarily part of the appeal of this particular cause. And it's a cause that has, within a relatively short space of time, generated a huge amount of investment in the formation of NGOs, most of which are now no more than 15 years old. And it's also proved extremely popular amongst celebrities. So Dina Haynes talks about the celebrification of human trafficking and the extent to which this cause, apart from other causes, is particularly interested in terms, is particularly attractive in terms of celebrity endorsers. So it's also articulated in metrics of success which link progress to individual acts of rescue. So the dominant mode of intervention, it's not the only mode, but one of the most popular one is articulated around the idea of raid and rescues. Sometimes this involves, in particular cases like, kind of private vigilante justice, where people kind of sign up in order to engage with police in order to go on raids. And in this kind of incarnation, success against slavery today is measured by numbers of people freed. There's a few silences here in terms of what happens after they're freed, whether they want to be freed, and so on and so forth, but I can't get into all of those details. But within this context, the rescue is not simply an analogy, it is part of the self-presentation of the politics associated with anti-slavery and anti-trafficking. So, in my incarnation, in my diagnosis, there are certain elements where a broader genealogy comes into focus, where you can point to certain similarities and connections with the history of anti-slavery. And in this mode, I'd suggest that the history of anti-slavery is often misunderstood. And it's misunderstood because it too often involves the projection of modern notions of equality backwards through time, such that anti-slavery motivations become kind of proto-egalitarian commitments which align with contemporary instantiations such as the civil rights movement and are kind of aligned with broader contemporary notions of non-racialism, non-sexism and the like. And I think that's a kind of misreading. That's not to say that some of those elements aren't there, but I think they're too often described as the dominant rather than a subsidiary cause. And the dominant in my reading of this is very much tied to modes of hierarchy where the world is divided into the civilized and the so-called savage, the backward, the benighted, the native in a colonial African context. And it's in this kind of incarnation that you see people pleading for help. And I'd suggest that this most famous of the abolitionist icons can't be read easily or obviously in equality terms. This is not a figure who is in a position of equality, and that's why in a lot of cases contemporary commemorations of slavery are very keen to have slaves standing up rather than kneeling, as a reaction to some of the tropes that are kind of associated with this particular thing. And as someone who's kind of based in kind of sub-Saharan Africa, in my analysis, this form of anti-slavery is particularly significant not in relation to transatlantic slavery, but is instead needs to be connected to the late 19th and early 20th century, where anti-slavery features as a form of legitimation for unprovoked wars of colonial conquest. And it's in this conquest we have most infamy, the Brussels Conference, where King Leopold of Belgium pulls together other European powers for a Brussels Act, which at the time is described as the Magna Carta of Africa, but of course tragically ends up in a scenario where Leopold's rule in the Congo is legitimated and all kinds of deeply horrific things happen as a consequence of the so-called civilizing mission to which the Brussels Act and Leopold and others ascribed. So these are late 19th century images that kind of predate the colonization of Eastern Africa, and they create a juxtaposition between Africans and so-called Arabs. And it's in the cause of protection against Arab slave traders that a lot of the civilizing mission and conquest arises. So anti-slavery historically is tied to the white man's burden. Anti-slavery historically is tied to divisions of the world that divide a civilized core and construct that civilized core as having moral obligations towards the tutelage and paternalistic protection of other parts of the world. And in this incarnation, rescue becomes a framework around which various forms of intervention and instruction are legitimated and articulated. And in my analysis, anti-slavery functions as a symbolic test of vice or virtue. So this is a kind of postcard that I found in the Oxford archives from the 1920s, and it constructs anti-slavery as something around which Anglo-Saxon peoples are assumed to have unique and special connection to, and by dint of their superior position are assumed to have more investment in. And the construction here is out yonder, other parts of the world, what we now call the global south, but which in this incarnation is still very much a kind of moment where colonies and colonial administrators are dominant. And how you stand against slavery becomes a litmus test of your moral worth as a community, as a religion, and the values of anti-slavery are understood to be imputed or ascribed to the Christian faith, to the white race, and to European civilization. And while there are other things going on, there are nonetheless strong echoes in this historical genealogy which connect contemporary expressions of the politics of rescue to this broader history and political project which constructs and divides the world between supplicants and saviors. And I direct your attention here, as is characteristic of a lot of kind of similar maps of the world, the red is designated as threat and alarm and concern, and it divides the world up into a particular image of who needs to act and who will be acted upon. So I'm kind of over time at this point, so I'm going to have to do the second element much quicker. So within the marketplace of ideas, in this kind of line of argument, it should come as no surprise that the politics of rescue has a level of resonance and significance that sets it apart from other causes and issues. But it's obviously acutely set apart from the countervailing approach, which is very much tied to redress for cumulative harms over long historical time horizons. So I've included here a famous image from the 1960s, and I'm particularly interested in the idea of I am a man, because it cuts against a particular colonial trope of the so-called native peoples under colonial rule being perpetual backward children. So even in a contemporary South African context, it's not uncommon for adult African men in their 50s and 60s to be described as in terms of the diminutive boy. So in this context, being an assertion of manhood is not simply an assertion of equality, but also an assertion of the importance of agency as exercised by individuals on their own behalf, rather than the idea that agency is best exercised on behalf of others, which is the idea of kind of tutelage and paternalism. So I'm going to have to do this super quick. Within the politics of repair, there's a different genealogy. It starts with the Haitian Revolution, and the Haitian Revolution cuts against the grain of the idea of anti-slavery as a benevolent gift from great emancipators, but is instead tied to a history which emphasizes how slaves fought and won for their own freedom rather than having a gift given to them by someone else. And this ultimately connects the Atlantic world, or the Black Atlantic, and thereby implicates Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And doing this super quickly, it's also something where instead of a singular issue being a focal point for mobilization and activism, there's instead an aggregation of a number of different harms. So while transatlantic slavery is the primary focal point around which reparations claims are articulated, they also run together all of the horrible stuff that happened in the aftermath of legal abolition. So you have the kind of linking where Coates talks about 250 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow, 60 years of separate but equal, 35 years of state-sanctioned redlining. So the continuing harms idea, the prison industrial complex, the idea of neocolonialism aggregates a series of moments of history into a larger kind of collective claim. And okay, I'm going to do this very quick. So there's a little bit of a disclaimer that says that I'm probably not going to capture everything I otherwise should have. The first idea is that of breaking the silence. Arises in the mid-1990s, at least in part out of projects associated with the UNESCO Slave Route Project. And this is very much tied to kind of ideas that are kind of familiar within transitional justice circles, where in order to address something, you first have to have a recognition that a wrong was done before anything else can follow. Secondly, you have three initiatives that I want to very, very briefly flag. The first is the UN International Decade for People of African Descent, which has kicked off 2 years ago and is tied to kind of politics of recognition. And I'd specifically note that in the bottom slide we have recognition, justice, and development. And this is a very different kind of conception of the types of projects that were required. Firstly, recognition, breaking the silence. Secondly, justice, which is only something that's required when harms have been inflicted. And thirdly, development, which in this incarnation is tied to a series of claims about the need for restitution for patterns of privilege and inequality. So the strongest kind of example we have of this is the CARICOM reparations claim, which is a claim that has been made on behalf of a number of nations in the Caribbean against specific states in Western Europe who are held responsible for the underdevelopment, kind of building off a kind of Rodney argument and others, of the Caribbean, and a specific need to redress a bunch of harms relating to health, relating to education, relating to the scar that slavery has said to be left upon the social order of particular societies. So here, while reparations is often kind of reduced to individual cash payments, that's a bit of a misnomer, because what is really understood by this term is a form of kind of collective redress which speaks in development terms to repairing the wounds that had been generated by slavery. But significantly, it's not just slavery. So the CARICOM claim links in claims associated with indigeneity. So it speaks to the Caribs as the original kind of First Nations of the Caribbean. And in broader kind of reparations arguments, you'll find slavery as a century-long legal institution linked together with a whole bunch of problems and issues that arise out of race and discrimination and privilege and the like. So for the last several years now, there's been campaigns in London around the question of reparations and repairing the wrongs of the past. But what's significant from my purposes is the integration of a larger portfolio of issues. So police brutality, racist immigration, school to prison pipeline, land grabs, austerity, sexual violence, forced sterilization, where the perspective is one that really speaks to underlying systemic harms and seeks to understand the cause of repair as being something that requires redress on a whole bunch of different fronts. So I'm mostly out of time, but what I would say in kind of summation is that within this idea of a marketplace of political ideas and political activism, we shouldn't be overly surprised that these two conversations around slavery, both of which have slavery as the starting point for activism and mobilization, generate incredibly different responses in terms of their reception. So anti-slavery and the campaign against modern slavery has been feted throughout the globe, has generated all kinds of investments, movies, celebrity endorsements and the like, while the cause of reparations and repairing the wrongs of the past has necessarily, and I guess somewhat unsurprisingly, struggled to gain the same kind of audience and investment. And significantly for my purposes, I don't think it's useful to expect the intersection around a shared concern around slavery to generate solidarity across causes. Because solidarity would require, at some level, a broadly compatible image of the world we live in and a sense of who the key protagonists are, and I don't think that is the case on this occasion. So, on the one hand, the politics of rescue are at some level conservative. They take an image of the world as it is and understand positions of privilege as being partially offset by the benevolent paternalistic protection that arises out of positions of privilege. While at the same time the politics of rescue necessarily involve a challenge to the status quo, which is inherently more radical, and thereby challenges the foundations around which privilege is understood, because instead of help and discretionary assistance, it's instead an argument about the need to atone and repair for the cumulative weight of centuries of exploitation, vulnerability, and abuse, and the like. So that's my kind of sense of how these two fit together. My last slide is the self-promotion slide, wherein if you're interested in a lot of these issues, I would direct your attention to a project that a bunch of colleagues and I have been running for the last 3 years, and it's called Beyond Trafficking and Slavery, and it's very much tied to the idea that much of what takes place under the rubric of combating trafficking and slavery has certain features that we might want to kind of challenge or question, and that instead of the ways in which these arguments and interventions are taking place, we need to instead link up what's happening in the world to underlying structures, privileges, and the like. So, thank you.